let's make a start. I'm going to say a few words of introduction. I'll say something about the logistics, and then I'll say something about how Fitz-Gibbon, who we're here to celebrate. Sad occasion in some way, but there's a lot to be positive about in Carol's legacy. And then we've got about 5 other speakers after that. But don't worry, nobody's going to take too long over this, and a lot of people getting together. Well, welcome to everybody from Carol's life, which goes back, I think, to one of her former classmates in school, right down to people coming from Perth in Australia to Los Angeles that are here, to people who knew her at Durham and before that at UCLA and so on, and even from the campaigning days in the 1950s. So we've got an enormous variety of people who knew Carol from her enormously varied life, with doing many different things, with many different people. There is at the back a condolence book, which we hope everybody will say something in, write and put their name on, and that can go to the family after it. There's a table of a few publications coming from Carol down here, do please have a look at that, and there are news articles and others here just as a kind of sprinkling of what went on at that time. And everybody will be sent an email with a link to publications from Carol's life, and if you think any are missing from that, please email to say so. Today's been organised by a lot of people, but I've got to say thanks to Gemma for enormous work in putting this on here, so thanks Gemma for doing it. Well, Carol was a great teacher, researcher, innovator, writer, speaker, scientist, iconoclast and friend. And I'm going to pick up on 2 of those themes to say a few words before other people will also say things around that. So as a teacher and a writer, she affected a whole generation. When she was in the University of California in Los Angeles, after she'd just been spotted by Noel Alkin, later a PhD supervisor, she was asked to co-author a series of how-to books, how to conduct an evaluation, how to analyze data and so on. They proved to be enormously successful, sold in vast quantities in the United States and here, and made a mark for the way to do evaluations in a proper scientific way. She herself wasn't paid a penny because she was asked to do it by the university, but it did make the name for Sage, and Sage Publication really had its beginning in Carol's work. Quite an astounding achievement at that time. And in it, you can feel her deep understanding of research methods and her way of explaining it in a sensible way so that people can build on it with examples on how to take that forward. And that was exemplified at Newcastle University, where she was appointed by Dennis Child as Professor of Education, well-known psychologist, much to the chagrin of some of the faculty who thought, what are we doing with this research methods, this American coming over to tell us what to do and so on. Well, she changed them over time, but she ran a course on research methods, and several people here will have done that and know that it's not an easy thing to take teachers after a full day's work and give them 2 hours of research methods, which they probably weren't interested in knowing about in the first place. But she made it into a wonderful occasion. 100-odd people, just as here today. She sat them out in tables, just as here today, but sat them out with forethought, because she'd learned about peer tutoring, she'd invented it, or working in Los Angeles in one of the really tough schools where the gangs were operating outside, and she'd worked out that peer tutoring, getting one person to teach another person, was a way forward in those situations. So at Newcastle, she sat around the table, the quantitative with the qualitative. She gave them problems to work on. And for many people, that was a formative experience, which set them going in a long way. I certainly remember it myself, and she gave everybody a test at the end, another thing that everybody thought was an awful thing to do, but it was part of the feedback to her and to others to take it forward. That peer tutoring which she spotted remained a theme throughout her research work, and she encouraged many others to take it forward. A great way to get people to learn is to get them to teach it. And throughout Carol's life, she herself wanted to learn, and she wanted to get other people to understand the world, and she really set about learning all of her life. In fact, at Newcastle University, she was on a team that went around with all the faculty And one favourite question was to ask the historians, what have you learned in the last year? And there was a bit of which was good. Carol was an innovator and an activist. So she was always ahead of the game, impatient and dissatisfied with the status quo. I'll give a few examples here. When she was at California, it was at the time when the educational elite were looking to evaluation, producing theories of evaluation. She wrote a paper at that time called Theory-Based Evaluation. It said that if somebody's going to evaluate something, they should know what the people had as their theory of change to begin with, and would look at that and how that changed. That paper took the wind, and it's now being copied and taken on by many, many people. Typical for Carol, she later said, oh no, that's not right, I'm not going to do that. But other people did, and still famed because of it. She picked up meta-analysis, a way to integrate all of the information from experiments in social science, and take those together and bring them into one using meta-analysis. She worked with Brown Dockrell in Edinburgh, and to bring this idea from the States over to England, she set up a seminar at Durham. She was so far ahead of the game, nobody came. But nowadays, meta-analysis is absolutely the way forward. It's almost passé, but she was ahead of the game when she did that. But in her innovation, most people will know her for her work on monitoring systems, and in particular on ALICE, the A-level information system, known in its first days as confidential measurement-based self-evaluation. Set up in the Newcastle area with about 12 schools, and she set that up what she called her disreputable research, because it didn't involve experiments, it involved passive observation. It carried on doing not very much for a number of years, and then kind of took off when people started to take interest in monitoring performance indicators, and I happened to be the first research associate working on that in the first days, and that kind of expanded and expanded and expanded into other projects and provide a model for how to do valuations. Over here you will see the value-added national projects on how to do that for England, which was partially understood by politicians. But she also set them up in Scotland, also set up a centre in New Zealand, and in Australia, and in Hong Kong, and all those things continue to this day. But she became dissatisfied with Newcastle University. Dissatisfied why? Because they saw how well she was doing, and the money was coming in and demanded some of it. So she and I moved to Durham University. Great move. And Carol was really appreciative. Look at this room here. Supposedly the oldest room in use of this size in any university in the world. You're here on a World Heritage Site. Quite an amazing place to be. The university is not quite as old as the room, but it's certainly using it to good effect. I might say that she also got dissatisfied with Durham. And she and I set up a bank account in which we were going to move the money across. I still got the bank account, we didn't do anything with it. She was outraged by unfairness and wanted to do something about it. And there are a number of occasions we might hear a little more about things that were wrong that we need to do something about. Prime example in her day was Ofsted. What an outrage. People with opinions but no evidence going in to bully people, to tell them what to do. She set up a rival organisation, Ofsted, Office for Standards in Inspection, made sure that the only people who worked on it were already retired so the inspectors couldn't get at them. That work still goes on, I would say. Ofsted haven't quite been got rid of it. Fried coffee was still working. Carol was a great speaker, much sought after. She could be incisive, funny, irreverent, and persuasive. I just give one little phrase that she used to use to large audiences when the politicians were bringing in yet another reform to education. And the phrase was as educationists, we're used to people working with people with special needs. We're just surprised to see them in charge of us. She could also be outspoken in a one-to-one, and I'll just tell you one final story here, where she and I went to see the Vice-Chancellor of this university, that's the President for those from America. Those Vice-Chancellors are kind of powerful people, and they decide the future of universities and the rest, and we were regretting the way that the universities had evolved in the UK, and she said to our Vice-Chancellor, it's these pusillanimous vice-chancellors that are the problem. We didn't spend a lot longer in that room. But she wasn't prepared to take nonsense, and she wasn't prepared to stand up and be candid. And I think one reason that she didn't get an MBA or an MBE or an OBE was because she was, although we tried to get her, because of that outspoken voice that you saw. Finally, I would say that Carol's touched many lives, certainly all those in this room, and the many who are not in this room. She's gone, but her ideas live on. Her ideas and the vision lives on. She'll be missed by many. Thank you. We're going to hear from, I think, 6 different people. So we're going to start here with Carol's grandson, Mr. Taylor Fitz-Gibbon.
Hello. So I didn't know that I was going to be on the program until I got here, but I did manage to write down a few things, and I'm not quite the public speaker that my grandmother was, but hopefully I can give you a sort of different perspective from how I saw it. So she was my grandmother. I used to spend whole summers with her over here. I moved first to Newcastle and then Durham. And obviously she had a huge impact on the world broadly, and I think just being here in this room is a testament to that. But from my perspective, and sort of what stuck with me is that yes, she had an impact, but she also definitely enjoyed herself. And it's a bit hard doing this now because she's been gone for so long. That even though she only just passed in January, she had Parkinson's, so she wasn't herself for a very, very long time. But it sort of creates a quasi-experimental condition where it allows for us to see, what stands the test of time, what sticks in our head over all this time of the Carol that we knew. And so certainly I will never forget that, at least until I get Parkinson's too, that the main points from her career that I'm sure many of us know well. But I also picked up something more subtle, perhaps also more important, sort of a zest for life. At least from my perspective, seeing her mostly as a late career, highly successful woman, she had a kind of inner freedom. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind and ruffle feathers, but she wasn't trying to offend anyone for no reason either. She was an iconoclast. She was the granny who saw one of those BS signs at chain stores, like in an airport or something, and says, "Oh, our customers come first." And she took a Sharpie marker and crossed out customers and wrote in shareholders. In a crowded, probably like an airport or something like that. And so I've spent quite a bit of time looking through old newspaper articles that she was featured in, and I love how bits of her personality come through even when she's being criticized. You can see some of them over here. But I'm just going to read a quick passage from one of them, which is actually a really nice profile of her, but there's a sort of a qualifying paragraph in there that says, "Some of her peers believe that she has taken this to extremes, that she has a narrow view of what counts as good evidence, that it's not possible always to measure things in the way she would want, that evidence can be more broadly based, that her combative nature and ready criticisms are not always helpful, but few doubt the fundamental importance of her critique." So basically, she's right, but we'd rather not think about that right now. So I'll end on what I think is sort of one of the funniest of these articles, and it's one that Peter Timm is a big part of as well. And I think you folks in education here will probably understand the context behind this article a bit better than I can. But basically, this competing organization, the National Foundation for Educational Research, used the slogan, Britain's leading, they had a slogan they used for 20 years, Britain's leading educational research organization. But my grand came along and filed a formal complaint with the Advertising Standards Authority on the quite right basis that large is not the equivalent of leading. And then she, I think my favorite part of this article is there's a quote from her in there, this beautiful passive-aggressive quote. It is, "I don't know anyone who thinks Enfer is leading the way in any particular area." I think it just sort of captures her personality. So yeah, she was wickedly smart and ahead of her time, and she certainly helped to change the world for the better. But she also, at least sometimes, managed to have a good time while doing it. And it is that energy, that personality, that enthusiasm for ideas, and the enjoyment she took from calling people out on their BS that I remember most. And that is what I hope to carry forward from her more than anything. So, thanks.
Now a slight change to the programme. I'm delighted to say that Michael Randall is here, who knew Carol in the 50s, and so we're over to Michael for a few minutes.
Yes, I first met Carol in the 1950s. I think she was at college in London at the time studying. And we were both members of a radical pacifist group called the Pacifist Youth Action Group. And one of the things that we did was to have a soapbox at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, Marble Arch Hyde Park. And she always got a good crowd. She was excellent at dealing with hecklers. And one particular moment stuck in my mind where one heckler just kept repeating, "Oh, it's cannibalism, it's cannibalism." And she just turned and she said, "It's not cannibalism because they don't eat the dead bodies." And I went on working with her. A few years later, the Direct Action Committee Against Nuclear War was organising a campaign in Africa to try and stop the French from exploding their first atomic bomb. And we were wanting to go to the community, the Arch, a pacifist community in the south of France. And I was going on my own. And lo and behold, I was in a station in Paris and bumped into Carol. So we hitchhiked down and carried on there, and we were trying to get people in France to back this, and we did finally get a few people. And that went ahead in 1957, I think it was. And among the people who came on that was Bayard Rustin, Afro-American, who went on to be a close associate of Martin Luther King and coordinated the March on Washington. Anyway, Carol was a lively, independent, we've heard about it already, but I knew her in this context. And I remember a few years later, Pat Arrowsmith of the Direct Action Committee, who is still alive and still active, and myself were parked in a caravan in the Midlands, conducting a campaign to stop the building of the short-range missiles that were being constructed at the time. So those are some of my memories from Carol in a non-academic context, but always found her very interesting, talking about this notion of the peer tutoring. And I think, and I gather from what other people have said, that that's had an enormous influence. I thought I would just say a few words about the other side of Carol, the campaigning, lively, energetic Carol that I remember.
Thanks very much, Michael. Now on to a former head teacher just from a few miles from here, who went on to London to work with other bodies down there. Sir John Dunford.
Thank you, Peter. Coincidentally, just a couple of days ago, we were clearing out some old papers at home, and we came across a memo that I wrote as head teacher of Durham Johnson School, just up on the hill there, to heads of department at the school in 1996. And the gist of the memo was, our A-level results were very good, but the ALICE data shows that only in a few subjects were the students' results significantly better than the ALICE predictions. There were lots of statistics and graphs followed to put flesh on the message in that memo and ensure that staff didn't become complacent about what were really very good raw results. Now in 1984, I'd been ahead there for a couple of years, and we were one of the first schools to join the ALICE project. And there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the use of that ALICE data underpinned an absolute transformation in our A-level work and the results, as I know it did in many other schools that subscribed to what was a groundbreaking project, which it's easy to forget just how groundbreaking it was. We found it invaluable to have that thorough analysis of the results, subject by subject, student by student, as well as the student attitude surveys and the chances graphs, which we used to raise the expectations of youngsters of what they could achieve. And the success of our sixth form, there's just no question, owes an enormous amount to the work of Carol, Peter Timms and the colleagues at the Chem Centre. I then became an advocate towards other school leaders for ALICE and the work of the Chem Centre, and so got to know Carol quite well during the 1980s and 1990s. People in the world can be divided into two categories: drains and radiators. And Carol was a radiator. And those of us who work with Carol drew on her energy, were inspired by her approach, and always enjoyed her mischievous wit. In particular, I admired that intellectual integrity, moral purpose, and highly principled approach to the use of data. My fellow school leaders knew that Carol's expertise offered them something they could get from nowhere else at the time: rock-solid data presented in a highly usable way. And at a time when most of us were learning to use PowerPoint in its most basic form, I remember Carol's talks to head teacher conferences were masterclasses in the amount of information that could be crammed onto a single slide. You could sort of feel it all pouring out of him, to the amusement, and I have to say sometimes the bemusement of people in the audience. You mentioned, Peter, you mentioned Ofstin, and I think Ofstin, the group that you founded to battle for a better inspection system. As in her battles with civil servants and ministers, that was Carol at her principled campaign best. Evidence-based policy of this sort and practice in education is at last, I hope, gaining a stronger foothold thanks to the work of Rob Coe and the colleagues still in the Chem Centre and many others. A foothold in the classroom and gradually in government, although it's a pretty slow process. But with ALICE, its sister project, Carol was a pioneer. She was years ahead of her time, but she sowed the seeds. She and you, others in the centre, sowed the seeds of some of the best education practice that's happening now. Generations of students and teachers owe an immense debt to the way in which Carol helped schools to do their best for their students. And those of us who were privileged to know her and to work with her knew that they were in touch with the very best of our profession, and with a lovely person too. Thank you.
Many thanks, Sir John. We're now moving on to someone who worked with Carol more or less in parallel, but in other universities. That's Professor John Gray, who's now at Cambridge, but knew Carol right back to, I think, the beginning, certainly before Combs was starting and earlier. So, John, over to you.
Thank you for inviting me here today to talk a little bit about the role that I knew, what she was like and what she achieved. One does need to go back a long way. Educational research has become much more sophisticated. Carol has played an enormous part in securing that. But very early on, both she and I were interested in how senior decision makers, inspectors and the like, made decisions about what were good schools and what were bad schools. And on one occasion, I got drinking with the Scottish HMI and invested heavily in pints of beer. And around midnight, I said to him, "So how do you detect a good school from a bad one?" Took out his finger, he rubbed it against his nose. I'd spent about £15 on the beer, and that's all I got by way of an answer. Karen and I were both shocked that schools could be judged on such subjective criteria, and in our different ways we set about providing some kind of toolkit that schools could draw upon. It's hard to think now how sophisticated those systems were, but that was one of Carol's contributions, to think systematically about how one could make a better job of evaluating schools. She was most insistent, and again Peter referred to this, way ahead of her time, in insisting that evaluation was backed by solid evidence. And the phrase evidence-based policy did not exist at the time, but Carol played a major part in creating that idea. And even when people talked about reforms, Carol insisted that they be conducted as experiments, that it wasn't self-evident that any particular reform would necessarily work. She was prepared for failure as well as success. A couple of things about the woman and the context in which she worked. It's very hard to imagine now that the education departments that she and I worked in were not particularly interested in research. The culture of research was a sort of sideshow. Education departments were about training teachers, and the knowledge from training teachers stemmed from having good experience in the classroom and passing it on to your pupils. Carol challenged that at every point, and I think changed some of the culture for the better. But even as she was in mid-career, there were vice-chancellors who didn't really accept that educational research was a proper social science, and there were heads of department who were not overly interested in what research output was. Carol challenged that at every point. I don't think Carol was a feminist, but she worked effectively in a profoundly sexist world, and she made good use of the skills that that perception gave her. One of her favourite ones was to start giving a presentation and then to stop for a moment and say, "I'm a grandmother." She never, as far as I remember, actually showed the family photograph album, but this had a way of disarming senior policymakers who were thinking, "What's this woman up to, and am I going to get out of here alive?" And then, towards the end, she would insert a slide that dealt with all the arguments for not doing what she was proposing before the people who were listening to her had got round to formulating them. And quickly realised that she might be a grandmother, but not the sort of grandmother they'd ever encountered before. She was one of those people who provided leadership for educational research at a time when the idea of female leadership was not particularly well established. There are other greats in the field, both the Browns, Margaret and Sally, Rose Driver, my former wife, Jean Barrett, and others, who had to deal not only with presenting the challenges of a changing education system, but dealing with the sexism that went with them. Carol was at the forefront in that respect. And finally, I have to confess that I did a great deal to try and avoid sharing a platform at any conference with Carol. I quickly learned to ask any conference organiser who to invite it. And they would reel off names and they would say Carol Fitz-Gibbon. And I would say, "Yes, and when are you thinking of getting her to put on her presentation?" They'd say, "First thing in the morning." I'd say, "Well, I'm actually not available until late in the afternoon." And then they would say, "Well, we're thinking around lunchtime." And I would say, "Well, I'm not available either until first thing in the morning we'll go." In other words, I did a lot to avoid being in the session either immediately before Carol or immediately after. I can come clean on this now because I retired. But I had one solid reason, which was it didn't really matter what I said. If Carol followed me, she captured the entire audience, infused them, created an energy and dynamism that I couldn't possibly cope with. If I followed her, they were so high they weren't listening to what I was saying anyway. So, Carol, I apologise for that. I was a little devious at times, but it helped us to survive. We've lost someone very, very important. She had the capacity to infuse thousands of teachers, and not only she had that capacity, but she exercised it in numerous contexts. We've lost someone very important.
Thanks, John. In walking around here, I do urge you to come and look at the other side of the sphere, where you will see a history line of Ken. And although it was started originally with evaluation projects by Colin McCabe, it was then taken over by Carol Fitz-Gibbon, who took a Coombs project and made the basis for the monitoring systems that we see today. During that time, many people became researchers or programmers or whatever else involved with that project, and several are here today. Well over 100, 150 of them, people employed in that way. And I'm delighted that we now have one of those, Neil Bethany, who's going to give us a perspective from the Research Associate over a long period. Neil.
I think it's probably more in the region of 200 actually. The number of people, there are more than 100 people working there now, so there must be more than 200 people who actually owe such a lot to Carol, to the organisation that she helped build. A lot of those people are here today, and today I'm probably talking on behalf of all those people. I first heard the name Carol Fitz-Gibbon way back in 1993. I've got the evidence here on my hand. I've kept hold of this ever since. I was just a research associate roaming around Newcastle University, and I saw this bulletin with vacancies for university, and I thought, well, perhaps there's another 12-month contract that I can have a look at in here. And here we go. The A-level system. There's a contract going there for research associate. Is that very interesting? Applicants need this and that, statistics. Yeah, that sounds good. Need to be willing to learn quickly about social science, an example of complexity. That's very intriguing, isn't it? That sounds fun. I thought I'm interested in this, although I wasn't ready to start a new role and I was still in the middle of a research contract. But as my little pencil note here goes, send CV anyway. So I sent my CV anyway. About 2 weeks later, I'm sitting in School of Education, St Thomas Street in Newcastle, chatting to Peter and Carol over a cup of tea. So Carol had been in touch with me after I sent my CV in and said, yeah, come in, let's have a chat. So I had a chat, and Julie had that chat, and my biscuits behaved really well, I think, and Carol said, yeah, but when could you start working for us? And I said, well, not yet, it'll be October. And she said, oh, well, you can't be this research associate for hours and provide John and other people with their great graphs to help them in their school improvement. But tell you what, when can you start? October the 1st, right, we'll get something in place, I'll sort a contract out for you, we'll find a job for you. So I did. HR process is not quite what they are today. Nice and quickly and easily, and over a cup of tea and a biscuit, which was great. Yet why did that? If we look at the description on that ad, applicants must be able to concentrate on the work until its completion. There's still a lot of work to do. That was a quarter of a century ago. Why? So for me, why, and for many people around here, why did that turn into such a long time? Why make that quarter of a century of work? And I think the answer is Carol, and all that she stood for, all that she believed, and all that she set up. She was so amazing, and her energy and enthusiasm and a passion for doing the right thing, and an inherent sense of what is right and what is wrong. If something's wrong, she's not the person you want to be doing the wrong thing in front of you. If you're the head of Ofsted, if you're head of the school, if you're head of the government, it doesn't matter, she will pick a fight with you if you were doing something wrong. No problem about that. Her integrity was just amazing. Her enthusiasm, her drive, and the way she would walk into a room full of head teachers at the conference, and she wasn't exactly waltzing. She would launch herself into that room and say, what are the issues in your school? What do you need help with? What can we do? What's going on? And it was just an absolute joy to see. And from my point of view, she was amazing the way she looked after us, she nurtured us, she helped us, she showed us the right path. And I've got one example I was going to share, but I've never actually confessed this in my life, and it's quite upsetting for confession. I'm going to do it anyway. 1996, I've been working there 3 years, and this little system that I'd started working on was by then becoming the biggest successful mass-produced secondary assessment in the UK. So things were going really well. I moved over to Durham from Newcastle, and about a week into my role at Durham, I plunked myself into one of the rooms, into one of the offices, and I sat down on a chair, really fed up, and I said, I'm really sick, in front of Carol. I felt really bad about it. I've never told anybody about this since then, until today. To put it into context, to explain what was going on there, we didn't have any internet access with the university. We couldn't run our programs, we couldn't analyse skills data. And that was a whole week of not being able to provide all these hundreds and hundreds of schools with results. These are the days when we analysed things and we printed up results and we sent them to schools and pieces of paper in the post, the old-fashioned way. But we couldn't do that because we didn't have any computing power, we didn't have access to the university's IT department. And it was really frustrating. So that was my reason for feeling so angry and frustrated and annoyed. And also, to give it a bit of context, I didn't actually realise Carol was in the room when I sat down with my potty mouth there. Now, what did she do? Did she reprimand me? Did she take me outside and give me good talking to some disciplinary proceedings? Or did she just walk off in disgust? None of the above. She took me over to her office and she asked me to explain what the problem was, what she could do to help, what was going on here. How can I make things right for you? And I kid you not, within 2 days of that, I looked outside my office in Durham House, and the car park was being torn up by a digger. And they were starting to lay cables through the car park, through to the centre of the university. And within a week, we had connectivity, we were analysing the results, schools would get the results again. How many leaders would have really done that for you? I don't know what she did, I don't know what battles she had in those couple of days, but that just shows what kind of person she was. I'll finish up. I'm going to drop on the speech shot. I want to just say that, as you see in the leaflet, there were a few words that I wrote in that leaflet a few years ago. It said, whenever I've got a problem at work, whenever something I just can't solve and things are just not going well, I think, what would Carol want me to do? Or what would Carol do? And if I follow that guidance, that invariably leads to the right answer. So even today, she's still guiding me, and I think she's probably still guiding a lot of people in this room. Thanks.
Carol, of course, influenced people in many ways, and one is by supervising students, in particular PhD students. And we hear next from one of her PhD students who was extremely successful and went on to be the now Director of Care, Rob Coe.
Thanks, Peter. Yes, I'm very proud to be Director of Care. Every day I think about different kinds of challenges, and as Neil just said, thinking about what Carol would have done, or the kind of moral courage that she had, the kind of vision for research and what Chem is, very much guides me in every day in what I do. So her legacy is very strong, I think, in what Chem is today. The whole organisation, the success it is internationally, as a research organisation, as an assessment organisation, as an influence in policy and so on, very much owes a massive debt to her. When Carol died in January, I was overwhelmed with a feeling of loss and a feeling of debt. And as Peter says, I was her PhD student and had worked with her for many years. And I wrote this piece which has appeared on the blog site, and I know that a few people have seen this and told me they liked it. And I don't think I can sum up what I feel about Carol and my memories of her better than just reading this. So forgive me if this is something that you're already very familiar with, but I'm going to read it again. So I wrote this just after she died. Last weekend, the education researcher who influenced me more than any other, my formative mentor, an inspirational leader and the most innovative educational thinker I have known, died. And yet the name Carol Fitz-Gibbon may be little known to a generation of educators who have emerged in the last decade through blogging and Twitter or the Westminster policy bubble to be the thought leaders of today. When I first met her in the early 1990s, Carol was energetic and forceful in a scatterbrained, whirlwind, big personality kind of way. She describes herself as a grandmother from the north and seemed to take pleasure in the way men in suits from Westminster would sometimes appraise her small stature, Lancastrian accent, friendly, unimposing manner, only to be blown away by the force of her intellect and passion when they, with almost inevitable predictability, said something uninformed or contrary to good evidence. She was a witty and engaging speaker, a kind and considerate friend and collaborator, highly principled in everything she did or said, very much old labour rather than new. Stories of her going out of her way to support junior colleagues could fill a large book. Carol invented the idea that came to be called value-added, though, as with Newton's invention of the calculus, similar ideas emerged independently at about the same time in other parts of the world. Unlike in the other manifestations, however, in Carol's vision, systems were not led by governments or districts as part of a top-down accountability process. Instead, the demand for value-added was school-led, fed by teachers' desire to have trustworthy, confidential information about how well they were doing. As this demand grew, so did Chem. Carol was its director from 1989 to 2003, during which time Chem grew from an exploratory research project involving 5 schools in the north of England to a multi-million-pound international operation supporting over 6,000 schools with purpose-made assessments and value-added analysis. In 1996, I left teaching to study full-time for a PhD at Durham with Carol as my supervisor. I'm sure all PhD students learn a lot from their supervisors, but I feel very privileged to have had the chance to learn so much from someone so wise. I remember one occasion in particular when I needed to analyse a data set and had found the literature divided between 2 distinct ways of doing so. I was unable to decide which was better and sought her advice. Carol's answer was simple. If initially unwelcome, you have to do both. If they give the same answer, you'll know the result transcends the methods. If they differ, you will know something important that you would not have known had you done only one. My debt to her is so deep, I cannot begin to itemise it. As well as pioneering value-added, Carol was ahead of her time in promoting a number of other big ideas. Unfortunately, she was probably too far ahead of her time to be contemporarily recognised as more of a leader than a maverick. Although many of these ideas are mainstream today, at the time she was almost the only voice against the tide of opposition. But within a decade of her retirement, the tide had turned. She wrote about meta-analysis in the 1980s, before anyone in the UK was doing it in education. She advocated randomised controlled trials as a basis for evidence-based policy at a time when all expert and influential opinion in education thought they were evil and misguided. She promoted the rash model and modern measurement theory when the UK was lagging behind the US and Australia in these methods. A leader, she clearly was. Carol's values and ideas are at the heart of everything Ken does today. Her memory and influence live on.
Nearly time for tea, which will be served shortly. Just to say that please look around the building. Please talk to everyone. Ask them about Carol, even if you haven't seen them before. I know Steve Strand, who's here, sent me an email saying, well, I know anybody who's here. Well, yes, absolutely, everybody knows a lot of people here, and it's worth talking. Do have a look at this, do have a look at the books, do look at the back. And one last thing about Carol. When she had visitors, she would often bring them here to the castle, rather than to Cathedral with all the religious nonsense that she knew went on there. But here she was also outraged. And if you look at the back here, you will see some more small suits of armour that were used for putting young children in the forefront of the battle so that the men at the back would be protected. Share the outrage as you see it yourself. Have a good rest of the evening.